Moses Taylor, a 19th century New York merchant and banker, and one of the wealthiest men of that century. His estate was reported to be worth $70 million, or in excess of $1.7 billion in today's dollars.
From the perspective of Moses Taylor, he is probably the least known major industrialist in this country. He is right up there with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and he has a rich and deep life of contribution to the United States in general, and Citi, the bank, then Citibank of New York in particular, which is how I come to know him. Long story, bank was originally founded to replace the first bank of the United States, started by Alexander Hamilton. Because of states' rights and versus federal constitution, they came up to renew the charter. They said no. New York State was where we had, literally in New York City, at 38 Wall Street, now 52 Wall Street, was the first headquarters of the first bank of the United States. It served to fund trade finance of merchants in New York with the Old World. There was a real political morass between James Madison and his vice president George Clinton around states' rights. And this guy, Sam Osgood, who was a Revolutionary War hero, first Postmaster General of the United States, real storied friend of George Washington, originally finance officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, one of the patriots, founding father type patriots, made it clear if there was not a charter given in the state of New York to replace the now defunct, soon to be defunct, First Bank of the United States, New York, as a port of trade, as a deep harbor location for goods, the transfer of goods and services with the Old World and then transshipping to the new colonies and the ever-expanding horizon of the United States, New York would cede its preeminence to either Boston or Philadelphia. That being said, he managed to literally squeak through and get the state of New York to award the bank a charter, then Citibank of New York. The charter turned out to be a very particular and special charter where the bank became the only federal depository in the Northeast. And that all happened because there were a few of the original bankers who happened to be moneyed and wealthy, who helped the United States government finance and pay off its war debt for the War of 1812. By the way, we were founded June 16th of 1812, and the War of 1812 officially started June 18th. So, by the way, 2 days after we became official, things got interesting. Anyway, fast forward. The folks who were the original directors and investors in the Citibank of New York, they were first and foremost businessmen. They were not financiers. And they were more interested in their businesses than in the financing of the bank in general. Not a bad thing, but they were a little distracted. At the same time, you have to understand the United States was very, very new, did not have a mature financial system, a treasury, common banknotes. It was literally 13 individual sovereign, in this case states, who came together in a federal government to declare independence, and they'd figure out how you actually make the thing work later. So, that being said, we went through a number of financial crises, and one, it was literally in 1837, was the first near-death experience for the bank. Knowing 2007, 2008 has been the latest. In our 200-year history, we've gone through a few. Anyway, John Jacob Astor invested a huge amount of money to save the bank. We're not really sure what his motives were, certainly it was a good financial arrangement, but near as we can tell, based on our research today, Astor saw then Citibank of New York as that important institution that really funded trade between the old world and the new. The other banks in the state of New York and in the port of New York were more interested in funding trade between New York and the interior and the other states. So remember, upcoming natural resources, lots of good stuff to get to market. How do you, in fact, fund that transaction? You can look domestically or you can look internationally. And the Citibank of New York really had an international view, even then. It was chartered as a merchant bank. And we understood that. And I have stuff that you can share that kind of gets in more detail. But fast forward, John Jacob Astor made it clear that if he was going to, in fact, float the bank, he wanted Moses Taylor, who had been his protege. And, oh, by the way, Moses had by that time made his money in Cuban sugar interests. And it turned out that John Jacob Astor was his mentor in helping him make that business. And Astor really appreciated Moses and said, he's my guy, he's got to sit on the board. Right? He's basically watching my interests here. Right? And so Moses Taylor made enormous contributions to the running of the bank at the director level. It was probably 14 years later, so the dates are in the book, but it was about 1850 or 51, Moses took over the presidency of the bank. Now, Moses was a brilliant man. He understood a few things. He was probably the first businessman to understand the notion of conglomerate. So think about what Moses did. First, he understood that he needed to get his sugar from Cuba to the U.S. and then from the U.S. either across the country or across the world. He didn't look for other traders, etc., or other merchants. He invested and bought infrastructure. And so you'll see that he has interests in shipping lines, railroads, etc. Turns around and looks and he says, you know, New York's a great port. New York is a great center for commerce. You have a brain trust. You have all of the skills, knowledge, and experience, traits, and abilities right here. This is the next London. Definitely clear. And I know in this summary I'm kind of boiling it all up, but the reality of the matter is, as you get into the literature, you get into the scholarship, you get into his personal papers and archives, this is what you thematically understand of the man. And it's what I'm saying, I believe, is, first of all, factually absolutely accurate, but it is materially correct. And there is really this notion there, and it's very defensible. So just to understand, Moses Taylor, understanding this concept and understanding that New York, if the nation were to grow, so his business could grow, right? Had this real understanding in that day and age. And I know we talk about those first industrialists as robber barons, right? That's the kind of pejorative term that we retrospectively apply to them. Think about Carnegie Mellon and the Carnegie Endowment. And so, no, these folks really had a concept of giving back. But their concept of giving back was you make a lot, and you then become a philanthropist and you invested in these. Moses Taylor he was a philanthropist and had charities, etc. But he also had this real understanding that if you invest correctly, you create what today we would think of as jobs and opportunities. That raises the tide, which raises the ship, which raises the tide. So he looked at the infrastructure of New York and said, woefully inadequate. So he began to invest in many, many different things, but most important, what today is Con Edison. This understanding that you needed to get gas. At that point, it was first gas. You needed to get gas into houses so that you could light lamps that weren't candles, so you could actually work at night in the winter. And so he invested in gas companies. He acquired gas companies. He consolidated them into what later becomes this conglomerate that ends up by being Con Edison. But in this concept of building infrastructure, railroads, etc., so vertical and horizontal integration. So vertical integration within any given industry and horizontal integration among industries to create what today we think of as infrastructure and the fundamental basic requirements to do business. So fast forward, one of the big damn problems is communications, right? If I want to do business with you, I send you a letter. 6 weeks later, you send me a letter back. Another 6 weeks, you get my response. We sign the contract. How do I shorten that? Well, telephone's invented. He runs into a few people who understand this notion of long-distance telephony. By that time, there had been underwater cable systems already pioneered in the southern Mediterranean between North Africa and Europe, etc. The man who kind of invented that kind of way of doing it comes to Moses and what about a transatlantic cable? And so Moses invests in today the transatlantic cable, and oh, by the way, Western Union. That was him. Okay? Now, a precursor company that grows into, but so this is the man that you're talking about. And he's an individual that had a vision that was really pragmatic and had a discipline. Moses Taylor did his own books. And I know that surprises everybody, but literally every night he would take the books from the bank, and I should explain what that means in a second, and did his books, and by doing that was doing his books for all of his companies. So he was actively involved in the day-to-day in some ways, understanding of how everything was working. Today, that would be the equivalent of having a bunch of people every day giving you the kind of end-of-day financial reports for the portfolio of the company. CEOs do it all the time. Moses Taylor was the first person that we know of that did it on a grand scale across a portfolio of companies and understood the real important value of that kind of information and knowledge. Knowledge segue. He also understood this notion of succession planning. Moses Taylor did not create things for his own. I'm sure he enjoyed all of the adulation in his time, but probably one of the most important reasons why he is so little known. I mean, people know Carnegie, people definitely know the Rockefellers, right? Why don't they know the Taylors? The long story is he was about the work, near as we can tell, more than the fame. And so he had this real understanding and notion of succession. And his daughter married a young man named Percy Pine. And Percy Pine turned out to be quite the right individual. This was not nepotism. In fact, Percy Pine had been Moses Taylor's hand-picked successor, and that's how he met Moses' daughter, right? That's how he comes to be the son-in-law. But Percy Pine went through a rigorous education about what the business was, etc. He was mentored. before Moses hands over the reins. So he also had this understanding of how you create something that passes forward into future generations. For that and a lot more reasons, right? Just skipping on the surface. Although the bank was formed in 1812, the bank that we are today, and the reason why we're 200 years old and we survived, was the great thinking of Moses Taylor. If it hadn't been for Astor identifying Taylor as the person that needed to be on our board and later become our president, the bank may not have had the rich and storied history that evolves. A couple of things that are really important. Moses Taylor looked at the bank and took it out of the general business environment. He had more than enough companies that could give the bank business, and he used the bank to actually be the treasury of all of his companies. Right? And understood how to help and manage the cash flow and the liquidity of the companies that were doing business, and honed a real expert understanding of corporate banking. It was literally what transformed Citi from a merchant bank into this global behemoth that we've become, where literally we finance progress, which became a tagline for the bank in explaining who the bank was post-Taylor, but we're financiers of progress. That's how we thought of ourselves, thanks to the Taylor legacy. But the thing that Taylor also understood was good, let's call it fiscal prudence. And so he understood this notion that he called ready money. As a federal repository, by then, under his watch, we went from Citibank of New York to National Citibank. We became a national bank. In that sense, we forewent our our New York City charter and went to a federal charter, right? Although New York still had jurisdiction, New York laws, banking laws. A little complicated, but states' rights, federal rights, yeah, they're involved in that. Anyway, long story. If we needed to have capital adequacy, for every loan you need to have it covered and plus X in reserve, Moses Taylor essentially said, I want double that. You can't make a loan unless you can put aside double as a reserve. Trust me, you need to do that. Because of this ready money policy, remember the United States did not have a central bank. The National City Bank of New York became the de facto central bank for the United States. Why? Because it became the lender of last resort through every fiscal crisis, including government crises. Where were you going to find the capital to stabilize the market? Well, National City Bank, 55 Wall Street, you know, that building over there. Go there, they've got the money in gold reserve, ready to walk across the street and give to the federal vault, 3 blocks away, literally on cards. Anyway, so what ends up by happening is for each fiscal crisis that the nation faced, we became the lender of last resort, and in doing it, we became a more and more trusted institution, and by becoming a more and more trusted institution, by the time Moses Taylor retires and Percy Pine takes over as his successor, our portfolio of companies stop being Taylor specific and start expanding to what today are well-known multinationals. W.R. Grayson Company, were one of our first clients. Standard Oil, one of our first clients. So what's happening is we become literally the central hub for cash flow for all globally interested and forward-facing U.S.-based corporations. There is a heck of a lot more detail, but because of our status as a federal repository and the recognition that we were the lender of last resort, we were not allowed to open up branches or have a foreign presence. That's, how do you keep? I mean, this is the Bank of the United, basically the de facto Bank of the United States. You don't have branches, and it was kind of a safety thing. So what do? We create correspondent banking relations with other banks. So literally, thanks to the Taylor legacy, the Pine continuance, and then Pine brings in a gentleman named James Stillman, we were able, by 1897, to take any deposit in any currency anywhere in the bank and have it appear in any ledger in any location anywhere in the world for any one of our clients. And our clients, although we were not particularly focused on what we would call retail banking today, banks did not serve common men as institutions on an individual basis. It wasn't the notion of a bank, a retail bank as we know for the average middle-class citizen, doesn't really appear until about 1913. Mostly banks served wealthy, on the individual basis, wealthy folks. But that being said, whether you were a wealthy individual or a corporation, you could go anywhere in the world and get money from your account from any other place that the bank did business through its correspondent network. And all of this, in one big summary, is really the seed that Moses Taylor planted and the direction he showed. He becomes a standard reference for what's right. And I mean that in the sense of, in any discipline, whether you're talking about science or economics or even the arts, there's something that we all understand as first principles, right? So in science you might think of them as things like the law of gravity. Open your hand, something's going to fall down, it will happen every time, and here's why. Right? Moses Taylor brought those first principles to finance and global banking. That's who the man was. I mean, there's no doubt he was one of the most important thinkers in modern finance.